1991 Congressman Frank Horton Speaker Series. My name is John Simmons, coordinator of tonight's event and a former chairman of the student government. Save that applause for later. It is wonderful to see such an impressive turnout tonight to hear President Carter, and we are delighted that he chose to include RIT among his limited number of speaking engagements. We are pleased that among our special guests is the Mayor of Rochester, Tom Ryan. Mayor Ryan, will you please stand? Now, here to introduce our speaker tonight is the acting president of RIT, Dr. Thomas Plow.
I appreciate our students giving me the opportunity to introduce a great American. I consider it a rare privilege to do so. The name Jimmy Carter has become synonymous with freedom, peace, and human rights. You know Mr. Carter as President of the United States from 1977 to 1981. Others of you may think of him as a governor of Georgia, a past chairman of the Democratic National Committee, a leader of the Camp David Accords, and the creator of the Department of Energy. Still others may think of him as a distinguished professor, a consultant on world issues, primarily through his leadership of the Carter Center. He has been a regular volunteer for Habitat for Humanity, a nonprofit organization that helps build homes for the needy in the United States. As well as in underdeveloped countries. There are still others who think of President Carter as a Sunday school teacher, a fly fisherman, a woodworker, a jogger, a cycler, a tennis player, and a skier, and of course, a peanut farmer. I know you're equally pleased to be sharing an evening with Jimmy Carter. Won't you join me in giving the warmest of RIT welcomes to our very special guest, President Jimmy Carter.
Well, if you enjoy my speech half as much as I've enjoyed the music, then you'll have a nice evening. That was just great. Thank you. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here at RIT. I've had a wonderful afternoon. This is one of the most exciting institutions that I've ever visited as an amateur woodworker. I was really thrilled and humbled this afternoon to see the beautiful work that they have done here and are learning how to do. I had a nice talk this afternoon with Frank Horton from Washington. He expressed his regrets at not having been here. He and John LaFalce, who represents this particular spot, have been very helpful to me when I was president. Both of them, Frank pointed out this afternoon, helped to pass the legislation that set up the Department of Energy and the Department of Education. This was a major step forward, I think, for our country. Well, this evening, I've come to talk to you. I had a long and nice introduction from Tom Plow. One of the things that I do is teach. I'm in my 9th year as a distinguished professor at Emory University in Atlanta. If you had seen me as a young kid running around when I was 5 or 6 years old, or even 8 or 10 years old, and said, what do you want to do when you grow up? My first choice would have been to go to the Naval Academy and be an engineer. My second choice would have been to be a college professor. It was an ambition I reached 4 years earlier than I had anticipated because of Ronald Reagan and the 1980 campaign. But I have enjoyed it. My wife and I have made a living since we left the White House writing books. We've had 6 books. They've all been on the New York Times bestseller list. One of them was number 1. That was my wife's book. But I would like to announce that all of them are still on sale, so if people... Well, as I said, I'm delighted to be here. I think that it would make me feel a little better if I started out with a joke, but I'm not a good joke teller. When I was running for president at the very beginning, in 1975, 76, by the way, I carried this county in 76 and in 1980, and also... Everybody said, well, he doesn't have a chance to win, but he's a Southerner, and you know, a Georgian can certainly tell funny stories, and he'll liven up the campaign a little bit. What the people didn't realize was it was my successor in the White House who was the good storyteller. I have never done it. Pretty well while I was in the White House. My jokes seemed to go over well to audiences when I was president, but after I left the White House, I kind of lost that ability. One exception, though, that I like to say to illustrate a point. I went to China and to Japan in 1981, and I was invited to give the graduating address at a small college near Osaka in southern Japan. They did not offer me a fee, by the way, but I made the talk anyway. Faced the audience, which is about as big as half of this downstairs, it was obvious that the Japanese were extremely nervous. I had just been out of the White House a few months. I was a little nervous too. And so I thought I would tell a joke to break the ice. If you've ever made a speech in English and had it translated into Japanese, you know it takes a long time to say things in Japanese. So I figured, well, I won't pick out my funniest joke, I'll just get the shortest joke. So I told my little short joke, and then the interpreter gave the joke, and the audience just collapsed and laughed. It was the best response I have ever had from any audience to any joke I've ever told. I couldn't wait to get the speech over to go back and ask the interpreter, how did you tell my joke? I've never told it so well. And I got back to the holding room and I asked him, and he wouldn't answer me. I said, look, you got to tell me how you told this joke. And finally he ducked his head and he said, well, I told the audience, President Carter told a funny story. Everybody laughed. Well, you can see there are some advantages in having been in the White House, President. There is life after the White House, and tonight I'm going to talk to you about 2 or 3 things. One of which is some basic changes that are taking place around the world, about which you may not hear very often, but are very significant in people's lives in other nations, in our country, increasingly in the future. Secondly, some of the things that the Carter Center does, that's where my wife and I work now. And third, what our country might do to enhance its own greatness. Well, I think the main thing that I would like to point out that is taking place around the world is an increasing gap or chasm between people like us who are, relatively speaking, extremely rich, and most people on earth who have very few of the advantages that we take for granted. We not only have money enough to come to a great institution like this, one way or the other, but we have enough food, we have a good place to sleep, we have clothing, and we have adequate health care. Most people on earth don't have any of these things. And that growing disparity is of great concern to them, of course, and increasingly to us. I'll just give you one example to illustrate the point. Africa, a great continent, 52 nations, for the last 20 years, has had a decrease every year in the amount of food produced per person. This sounds like kind of an idle statistic, but the fact is that every average of Africa now has 70 fewer calories per day than they had 20 years ago. And even then, the Africans had a very inadequate diet. This is of great concern. And it's the kind of thing that should be involving your concern. The Carter Center has 2 or 3 basic principles that we observe, and I'll just put these out in the beginning. First of all, we only take on projects that others are not doing or can't easily do. If we feel the World Bank or the IMF or the United Nations or the U.S. government or Harvard University or Brookings Institution can do something, we don't do it. Secondly, everything we do of a controversial nature is bipartisan or nonpartisan in nature. And we invite in prominent Republicans to join me on an equal basis when we take on something like that. President Gerald Ford has been down 4 or 5 times to the Carter Center to be my equal co-chairman. We've had others like Senator Howard Baker, when he was a majority leader in the Senate. Henry Kissinger has been down. And some of President Reagan's and President Bush's cabinet officers have come to join me. The third thing is that when we undertake a subject, it's not just for academic studies, it's for action. If we don't think that it will result in a direct action program, then we don't take it on. Those are the kind of things we do. So we have been concerned about starvation in Africa. And we formed a partnership with a man named Norman Borlaug. Dr. Borlaug won the Nobel Peace Prize in the early 1970s for his work in India and Pakistan in what's known as a Green Revolution, trying to help those people who were then starving produce enough food basically to feed themselves. And we're trying to bring about a Green Revolution in the sub-Saharan region of Africa. We now have several 100,000 farmers, small farmers, in our program in several countries in South Africa, Southern Africa, and we're trying to improve that all along. Another thing that we do is to try to alleviate suffering because of health deficiencies, not just nutrition. You might be interested in knowing that the Carter Center has within it what's called the Task Force on Child Survival. Task Force on Child Survival, responsible for the immunization of all the children in the world. We make sure, and have for the last 5 years, that UNICEF and the World Health Organization, Rotary clubs, and others that contribute to the immunizing of children work as a team and not at cross purposes or in competition. 5 years ago, only 20% of the world's children in the developing countries had been immunized against measles, polio, diphtheria, typhoid, whooping cough. 20% 5 years ago. Now, 80% of the children in those countries have been immunized against these diseases. This brings about another question. I'm just kind of skipping from one thing to another. As you can tell, I don't have a prepared text, but you might say, well, what's going to happen? I mean, why do you want to save these little kids' lives in South America and Asia and Africa? We already got too many people living in those countries. Let me give you a remarkable fact. The best and perhaps only way to reduce population growth is to reduce the infant mortality rate. That sounds like a contradiction or an anomaly, but it's not. There has never in the world been a country that had its infant mortality rate go down and let its babies survive, that didn't very quickly have its population growth rate go down. And if you look at a list now of all the countries in the world that have a very high population growth rate, say doubling every 15 or 20 years, that country will have a very high infant mortality rate. So we deal with that on a daily basis. It's a complicated subject. It would take up all my time to talk about it, but let me just give you 2 or 3 quick reasons. One is we teach women in the developing world that they can have some self-respect. They can manage their own affairs. They can shape their own destiny. They can be liberated from just being a husband-dominated, baby-producing machine. And the things that we teach them, in addition to immunizing their children and giving oral rehydration therapy to control diarrheal diseases, gives their entire family a good system of health care. Another very important thing is that in most of those countries, old age begins about 40 or 45, and they don't have any Social Security program. The only Social Security they have is to have a lot of boy babies survive to be grown enough to take care of them in their old age. So if they feel that their babies are going to live, they have much fewer children at the early age. And we can teach the women to nurse their babies for 18 months and so forth. So we are trying to hold down population growth in the world by making sure that babies do indeed survive. Another very important consideration with which we are dealing is forestry. We are organizing a task force on forestry similar to the one that we have on child survival to try to do two things. I'll be very brief. One is to protect the remaining rainforests and others, and then to replant areas where all the trees have been cut down. That causes a great deal of suffering. Causes a great deal of suffering that we can't even imagine. It also creates a great deal of tension and dissension, hatred, sometimes war. I'll just give you one quick example. In 1973, when the OPEC oil crisis came along, the average woman in the third world spent about 2 hours a day with her children gathering enough wood to cook a meal. Last year, the average woman in the third world spent 8 hours every day just getting enough wood with which to cook her meals for the family. And you can see that as the women have to go further and further away from their own village, they start to meet between the villages and they start competing for the last trees. This creates a great deal of concern. You can imagine if you were the head of a family and your family could no longer figure out how you're going to get wood to cook the next meal. It's a tremendous problem for them. Also, of course, once you cut down all the trees, the soil washes away, they can't produce grain anymore, and the streams fill up with topsoil and you can't catch fish anymore. So we're trying to work on forestry. Let me tell you another thing about dissension or conflict. This is a very interesting thing, and perhaps the most interesting thing that I'll mention tonight. We monitor at the Carter Center all the conflicts in the world. You might be interested in knowing that at the beginning of this past month, there were 111 conflicts in the world. We work in partnership with Uppsala University in Sweden. 111. Of those, 32 of them were what we call major wars. A major war is one within which more than 1,000 people have died on the battlefield in combat. A fairly substantial war. Some of those are horrendous in scope. For instance, Rosen and I, my wife, and I spent 26 days and nights, year before last, negotiating in just two countries. One was Ethiopia, to try to bring a ceasefire between the Eritreans and the Ethiopian government. I know you have some Ethiopian students here. And the other was Sudan. In the Ethiopian war, in the last 30 years, more than 1 million people have died. In Sudan, year before last, 260,000 people died in 1 year. But we hardly know about those wars. We don't care about those wars because the people live in Africa, they don't have oil, and so we don't feel that they're very important. Should concern you. Let me tell you another interesting fact. Of the 32 major wars, listen to this, not a single one of them is between two countries. None of them. Since the Gulf War ended a few months ago, a few weeks ago, no war in the world now takes place between two sovereign countries. That's an interesting fact. The tragedy is this. The United Nations and the U.S. government and the government of Great Britain and France and so forth are prohibited from dealing with those wars, except in very rare occasions. The reason is that it's not appropriate for a U.S. ambassador or an official of the United Nations even to communicate with revolutionaries who are trying to change or overthrow a government that's a member of the United Nations, or to whom our ambassador is accredited. This means that all over the world these wars are going on, sometimes horrendous in scope, and no one is authorized to try to bring peace to those people. That is one of the major tasks that the Carter Center has now undertaken with what we call the International Negotiating Network. We have tried to deal with these wars in an effective way. Not only do we monitor them every day, but conflict. I'm not going to dwell on this. There again, it's a subject of a whole lecture. But one of the things that we have learned is that people who hate each other, who have been at war, who've killed each other, find it almost impossible to sit down across a table and negotiate with one another. You may not understand this clearly until you think about, say, the Israelis and the PLO. They want the same thing, basically peace and so forth, but it's almost impossible to imagine them sitting across the table talking to each other. And that applies in many other cases. What we have done at the Carter Center is initiate a new way of dealing with wars, and that is through the holding of elections in that war-torn country when we can get both adversaries or enemies to agree to an honest election and agree to abide by the results. This brings about what I know as a former politician. I'm not anymore. 10 years ago I was in the White House, but I'm not anymore. But it's a matter of self-delusion. We have the mayor of Rochester here. I ran for office, was a state senator, and the governor as a president. Frank Horton, obviously, John LaFalce ran for Congress. People who run for office believe that they're going to win. They are convinced that if the voters just have an honest way to cast their ballots, if they know me and know all my opponents, whom are they going to support? Me, right? Well, in the case of a war, where people cannot talk to one another, we can get both sides maybe to agree to let us hold an election and let the people decide who will be the leader, not just decided on the battlefield. So we've lately put together an organization of 19 leaders in this hemisphere, all of us having been elected freely. And we have run some elections. We're learning how. We conducted the election in Panama. We conducted the election in Nicaragua, which ended the Contra War, finally. We conducted the election in Dominican Republic, and last December 16th, we conducted the election in Haiti. Haiti is a nation that was founded in 1804. It's the second oldest republic in this hemisphere, the oldest black nation in the world, and never have had an honest, chosen leader who cared about the people until last December. But that's the kind of thing that we are doing, and I think in the future, the wars that are now going on, say in Liberia, or in Angola, or in Afghanistan, in Kampuchea, in Sri Lanka, and so forth, the 32 of them, many of them might very well be resolved by holding an honest election in those countries. The last point I want to make, just going down the world's changing times, is in the Middle East. I personally, and you may not like this, I personally did not support military action in the which also makes me very proud. Most of the weapons that we used there effectively were developed under my administration or before that. The ones that came after my administration were the B-1 bomber, the B-2 bomber, and Star Wars, which I don't think will ever be helpful to this country. But I do know that it makes Americans very proud to see our military forces triumphant, and we are very proud of the men and women who went to the Gulf to serve their country so superbly. We had one death for every 1,000 people who died in the Iraqi army. We had 26 nations aligned against what was really a third-rate country, but we won a victory. But in the process, I'm not sure that anyone really came out a victor in that war. The reason I say that is that Iraq was bombed, according to the United Nations report, back into the pre-industrial age. Kuwait has been destroyed. The Kuwaitis are no closer to democracy and freedom and an absence of human rights abuses than they were before the war. 100,000 casualties took place on the battlefield. We don't know how many tens of thousands of civilians died. We have a million new refugees among the Kurds and a few Shiites to add to the 30 million that already were trying to find a home before this war took place. The Mideast peace process has been destabilized, in my opinion, and we have not performed well since the war was over in trying to deal with the ravages of the war. The decision was made, and the thing is now over as far as the fighting is concerned, I pray. But the point I'm making is that even a great victory for the most powerful nation on earth should not be the prime ambition of patriotic Americans. We should use our tremendous political, military, economic strength to promote peace. And let me point out, in the last 10 years since I left the White House, there have been very few military actions across an international border or in a foreign country. Let me list all of them for you that were started. The Falklands War, where Argentina, claiming the Falklands and Malvinas, said it was their own territory. The British disagreed. The next, in 1982, was the Israelis' invasion of Lebanon. We also sent our Marines into Lebanon with tragic results. We later launched an airstrike against Tripoli in Libya. We destroyed the French embassy. We killed some children. We missed the main target that we were trying to assassinate with our planes. We later invaded Grenada. We defeated Grenada. We later invaded Panama and won a victory there. And then we orchestrated the Contra War. And the only other exception to that is Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. You can see that on a global basis, almost all the military initiatives taken across a border into a foreign country were either supported or conducted by us. And this is not something of which we need to be ashamed as far as the quality of our military forces are concerned. But I think in closing my comments, I ought to point out some things just to summarize, to precipitate your questions. I have long been interested in peace in the Middle East. When I was president, I never thought we were going to have a superpower war, a Third World War, between the U.S. forces and the Soviets and their allies in Europe. But I have seen that there could be an explosion of military fighting in the Mideast, which we could not control. We've basically seen that with the Gulf War. It could break out even in the Holy Land itself in the future. And so we devoted a great deal of time to the Camp David Accords, which set up a set of principles. We call it a framework on which future peace progress might be made. And the significant thing about this is it's brief. You can read it in 15 minutes if you want to get down to the library. The second thing is that it was ratified by the parliament in Cairo in Egypt and also by the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. 85% of the Knesset members voted in favor of the Camp David Accord. So it's part of the law of Israel. It calls for the withdrawal of Israeli troops from the occupied territories. It calls for the honoring of UN Resolution 242. It calls for the granting to the Palestinians of full autonomy and so forth. That's a basic document. I think in the future that there is not a hopeless case. I'm not naive about it. I know a great deal about the Middle East situation, but it's not a hopeless case. There can be some things done that would lessen hatred or prove good faith. Let me just mention a few on each side. One is Israel could unilaterally, without any negotiation, open up the universities in the West Bank and Gaza. They were closed. They were closed in 1988 in January. They've now been closed more than 3 years. They hadn't been open at all to educate the young people who are Palestinians. Secondly, there could be some granting, unilaterally, without negotiation, to the Palestinians of autonomy. Although Prime Minister Begin insisted on full autonomy, which is in Camp David, that was his word, they haven't been given any autonomy. And they ought to be given the right maybe to elect some local officials, to collect their own garbage, to repair their own streets, to run their own grammar schools, to dig their own wells, to plant their own trees. These are things they cannot do now. That would be a step in the right direction. There could be some joint projects between Israelis and the Palestinians to promote improved health care, or improved education, or the building of homes, things of that kind. That has not been done either since 1967. On the other hand, what can the Palestinians do? First of all, they might very well say, okay, we're not going to include violence as part of the Intifada uprising. We're going to demonstrate our grievances and our problems, but we're going to do it in a peaceful way. The second thing that can be done is the PLO can change its charter to remove those paragraphs or statements they call for the destruction of Israel. Another thing that can be done is for some of the Arab countries, hopefully all of them eventually, to remove the trade embargo against Israel, to let the people of Israel know that they are dealing effectively with neighbors who want peace. What can be done to bring this about? Just a couple of things. One is some economic projects that might be done together. I'm just going to give you one example. All over the world, including many places in our country, shortage of water has become a critical issue. All you have to do is go to Las Vegas or go to Los Angeles and read the headlines in the paper every day. It's about water. We need more water, more water, more water. The same thing applies in the Palestine area. Nowadays, because of heavy irrigation between the Gulf, between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea with the Jordan River, the Jordan River is drying up. The Israelis have massive irrigation programs, the Jordanians have a few, and not much water is getting to the Dead Sea. In 1972, when I was governor, I went over as a guest of Mrs. Meir, and I wanted to go in swimming in the Dead Sea. So I did. I went swimming there. You can float about halfway out of the water, it just buoys you up like a cork. Last year, I went back to the same place, and the water was 300 yards away. I could hardly see the water from where I went swimming in 1972. The Dead Sea is drying up about this much every year. And soon we're going to have two little tiny Dead Seas because the bottom is going to be exposed because it's drying up. This is a horrible ecological or environmental disaster. What can be done? Well, last year I was in the Gulf of Aqaba. It happened to be on the Jordanian side. There's just a few miles from the Dead Sea. They've got a plentiful supply of ocean water. And both the Jordanians and the Israelis are working on a project to bring ocean water into the Dead Sea through turbines and generate enormous quantities of electricity at very low cost. And as you know, with very cheap electricity, you can process minerals. You can also make nitrogen in the air into urea fertilizers. And there are tremendous deposits of, say, potash and phosphate in the Dead Sea area. Wouldn't it be a wonderful signal to the rest of the world that would inspire people all over if you could see Palestinians and Israelis and Jordanians, engineers and builders and operators running the same major power plant and putting water back in the Dead Sea. It's 1,400-foot drop, equivalent to 8 Niagara Falls. And this would be such an inspiring thing. Another one, the last thing I'll mention is concerning tourism. It wouldn't cost anything to have tourism. All you got to do is open up the borders. I happen to be a Christian, but you don't have to be to have an exciting glimpse of what would be the case. You could go to Jerusalem, where Jews, Muslims, and Christians like to worship. Then you could go, if you're a Christian, to Nazareth and to Cana and then to Bethsaida. You could go around the Sea of Galilee. Then you could maybe go through Jericho, cross up on Mount Nebo and Jordan and see where Moses stood to look at the Holy Land, but he couldn't get a chance to go there. God forbade it. You can go to Damascus and see where St. Paul lived and where he was let down out of a window in a basket. You might go down to Egypt, not very too far away, stop at Mount Sinai on the way, and then go into Egypt where the Israelis lived in captivity, where Jesus went as a little baby. Can't you see the tremendous tourist attraction of that region if you could just cross the borders, which you can't do now? So it wouldn't take much money to bring about progress toward peace. Finally, what is the measure of a great nation? I've outlined to you hastily just a few problems around the world. One is a great nation, like ours, we have the greatest, should be a nation of peace. using his tremendous influence to bring about a peaceful resolution. Secondly, we should be the champion of human rights on earth. We should raise high the banner of human rights. When I was preparing to leave the White House in involuntary retirement, I made a farewell speech and I pointed out accurately, the United States did not invent human rights. Human rights invented the United States of America. We should remember that. The third thing is we should be the champion of environmental equality. If we are silent in this country, as we have been lately, or if we are the only negative nation in this country, as we have been lately, then nothing's going to be done about acid rain. Nothing's going to be done about the CO2 buildup, the global warming. Nothing's going to be done about ozone depletion. Nothing's going to be done about reforestation. If the leadership doesn't come from this country, it's not going to come from anywhere. And I'd say the last thing I want to mention, to be very brief about this summary, is that we ought to be a nation of sharing. We have been blessed by God with almost every possible advantage. We have freedom, we have democracy, we have enormous wealth, we have security, we have influence. You name it, Americans have it. There is a tendency for us, though, to be arrogant or self-centered in our privileged position. It's human nature to think, why are we so blessed? It's because God thinks we're better than others. We deserve these blessings. And in our self-congratulations, thinking we're superior people because we have been so blessed, we are reluctant to share with others what we have. It doesn't have to be global. I noticed that when I was introduced about habitat, there was a lot of applause here. That chasm that exists between people who have everything and those who don't have anything doesn't have to be between us and Ethiopia. It could be between where you live and 100 yards down the street around the corner. But I guarantee you that most of the people in this tremendous auditorium will go through life and never know a single family that has never had a decent home. Well enough to go in that family's home, sit down at the breakfast table, have a cup of coffee, know the woman's first and last name, get acquainted with her teenage kids who might be in trouble, and let them know they have a friend. You can always intend to do it. You will never do it. We need to reach out because that is what makes our life significant. As Americans, that's what lets us share without sacrifice on our part. When you reach out to someone else in need, it's not a sacrifice. It becomes a tremendous blessing. That's what a habitat does. That's what makes it so good. We don't give away anything. The families have to buy their house, pay full price without any profit, and with no interest. They have to put in hundreds of hours working on their own home. In Immokalee, Florida, 2,000 hours of work on theirs and their neighbor's house. They have to pay the full cost of the house by the month. And in the process, they learn a trade. We don't give them anything except love and affection and concern and a partnership. And as we get to know these people, whom we formerly scorned or thought they were kind of worthless, we get to know that they're just as good in God's eyes as are we. It is a wonderful experience. That is the measurement of a nation's greatness. Peace, human rights, environmental equality, sharing. We can't just say President Bush ought to do it, or Jim Baker ought to do it. It's up to us. The United States is what we are, it's what we request, it's what we demand. That is a source of greatness of a country. And I'm proud to be an American citizen. I'm also proud to have been the leader of the greatest nation on earth, realizing that we can be even greater in the future. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the students in the RIT community.
It's a small box, a container for just about anything that you would like to put in it, but it would be appropriate for hopes, dreams, and aspirations as well.
Professor Kaiser didn't say so, but he made this box. I think it's very beautiful, and I thank you.
We'll start with the microphone on the left. Please limit yourself to one question, and after a topic has been discussed, please move on to a new issue. We have many people here this evening who would like to ask the President a question, so please, let's keep it short. We'll go to the left side here first.
Do you have any comments on the recent Frontline program on PBS or the information that's been circulating about a possible deal between the Reagan camp before the 1980 elections?
Not really. Well, I prefer not to comment, but I will. During the hotly contested election of 1980, we heard rumors that there were some efforts made by the Reagan campaign team to interfere, but I didn't believe them at all, because to me it was kind of a nauseating thought that any American would deliberately try to delay the release of the American hostages and maybe even cause their death. Later, on Inauguration Day, I had stayed awake 3 days negotiating the release of the hostages, dealing with 12 nations simultaneously and through the Algerians, and with $12 billion that I had confiscated. And early that morning, January the 20th, 1981, the hostages were released. They were put in an airplane and they were sitting at on the runway in Tehran ready to take off early in the morning. They kept them in that airplane for several hours, and it was only 5 minutes after I was no longer president that the plane was permitted to depart. I figured then that it was because the Ayatollah Khomeini just didn't want, to reward me, because I had been the one putting pressure on them to get the hostages out. And so I heard rumors later on. The main report came from the president of Iran, who was president at that time. His name is Bani Sadr, now living in France. I understand he has a book coming out next month. But anyway, Bani Sadr began to tell news reporters that there was a deal, that the hostages would not be released until after the election, in return for which weapons would be provided to Iran basically through Israel. And of course, weapons did start flowing to Iran as soon as President Reagan was in office. Even then, I had no evidence, never sought any, didn't investigate, never asked a single question. A few months ago, Gary Sick, Dr. Gary Sick, who is writing a book on the subject, came down to Atlanta to show me some of the notes he had taken from interviews, and apparently a good number of people, I think he interviewed more than 200 people, but a good number of them said that they knew about such a discussion or deal between Bill Casey, who was President Reagan's campaign manager, later was the head of the CIA, and the Iranians. I don't know if there's any truth to any of the allegations. I never tried to find out. I think the allegations themselves are very damaging to our country and to the integrity of our government. Some of them do involve President Bush. My own thought would be that there could be some kind of blue ribbon commission, maybe 5 people, not members of Congress, but 5 people whose reputation would be above doubt, who could look into the allegations and make a report. And I would pray that the report would be there's nothing to it. You know, put an end to it. Because the fact that you asked the question, it was the first question I got at the press conference this afternoon. It was the first question I got in New York today at noon. When I spoke to the University Club, shows that a lot of people are concerned about it. But it ought to be laid to rest. And I think that an investigation of the facts and a report to the nation would be very helpful. And I would hope the President.
Mr. Carter, a few years ago, your daughter was arrested for participating in a demonstration against the CIA. And after a trial during which her defense was based partly on the necessity defense, which says that the crimes she committed were lesser than the ones that she was trying to prevent, she was found not guilty. This jury listened objectively to testimony about various CIA activities and found that what she did was justified. Would you care to comment on how, if the general public would listen objectively to evidence against the CIA, their attitudes toward it might change?
Well, I recall that incident very well. That was the 4th time Amy had been arrested. The first 3 times, Amy was demonstrating against apartheid in South Africa. The event to which you refer was at Amherst College in Massachusetts. Amy was there because she felt that the CIA were violating international law in mining the Nicaraguan harbors and in promoting war in Nicaragua, which eventually cost 35,000 lives. And you're right in saying that the jury did try Amy and a few other students and eventually found her innocent. Amy asked me to point out that all the jurors were over 30 years old, and when they found her innocent. You know, I think it's perfectly legitimate for the public to examine very thoroughly the policies of the CIA. As you will remember, in 1975, 1976, there was a definitive investigation of the CIA by the so-called Frank Church Committee. And it was found that the CIA had indeed committed fairly terrible crimes, including murder and plotting murder. And so there was a great deal of concern about it. I think I can assure you without any doubt at all that when I was in office for 4 years, the CIA never violated American or international law. And I think that's the way it ought to be. There are some things that the CIA has to do that are very private, confidential. However, under the executive order that I issued, that was supported by President Ford and also confirmed by President Reagan, when the CIA is authorized to carry out a mission that might be doubtful in nature or not subject to publicity, it must be shared with the key intelligence committees in the House and Senate. And the president has to sign an order in person, and then the CIA can carry out its role after the congressional committees have been informed. I think that because of that reform that has taken place, that most of the alleged improper activities of the CIA have been nipped in the bud. One exception to that was when President Reagan was so committed to the Contra war that they did permit not only the CIA but Oliver North and many others to perform acts that were indeed illegal. But I don't see any reason why the CIA basic policies and the policy of the president shouldn't be thoroughly scrutinized by the public and by the press.
Mr. President,
Yes.
Would you given any thought to negotiating, if it was possible, with the Palestinian leaders and the Israeli leaders, as you did with Camp David, with Sadat and Begin?
Yes, I would be delighted to do so. One of the freedoms that I have now that I didn't have as president is that I don't have to represent my country. I act as a private citizen, as a professor. And as you probably know, there are very few people in the world in any sort of leadership capacity who's free to go to Israel to meet with the Likud leaders who are in office now, who, by the way, did not vote for the Camp David Accords, with the labor coalition leaders who did support the Camp David Accords, who are not in office now, with the Peace Now people, with the human rights groups, with the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, with the Lebanese, with the Syrians, with the Jordanians.
That he took a leave and then notified the Board of Trustees later that he was working for the CIA. What do you think is the role of a university president as a leader and whether they should be working for the CIA?
If you don't mind, I'm going to let John answer that question. Well, I have to say, usually I answer questions very forthrightly, and I'll try to answer that one forthrightly. This is a free country, and we don't define as a community what a free American citizen can do. And I don't know. I don't know any of the circumstances surrounding the decision that was made by President Rose to take on this responsibility. I don't know anything about his relationship with the Board of Trustees. But I do know that having an intelligence agency as part of our nation is vital. We couldn't get along without it. It would be and I would say, not knowing anything about the subject, but if his responsibility is to improve the quality of the CIA, to improve the training of people who work in the CIA, to implant in the CIA higher standards of morality and ethics and abiding by the law, then his mission there could be very beneficial, not only to our country, but I think to the CIA and its integrity. I don't know, though, what his assignments are. I think it would be a very serious breach of propriety if the CIA in any way, dealing with President Rose or with this great education center or others, would use that relationship to further its own purposes in a secret or illicit fashion. And I would presume that would not be the case. So I've answered the question the best I can, not knowing anything about the circumstances.
People ask a question this evening on the right.
Mr. President, my question is related with this mediation effort that you paid.
Coca-Cola Company, you might be working for Eastman Kodak. You'll have perhaps a spouse, a husband or wife. You have a house perhaps that you're going to be paying for. You might even have a baby on the way. And you're going to be very careful not to let your employer know that you feel deeply contrary to your employer's policies. That is going to happen to you. So if you want to change the world in a way that you think would be a better world, to mirror the hopes and dreams and aspirations, the standards of ethics and morals that have made this nation great, now's the time.
Rochester community, I'd like to thank you for your outstanding presentation this evening, and please extend a warm round of applause to send President Carter on his journey back home.
It's been a wonderful day here at the ice rink. Jimmy Carter just spoke. We were without incident. No injuries as of yet.
So be advised, they got the permit for the carnival.
Being of the opposite political incident. Thank God I didn't have to pay.
Keep my
Cheap.
Okay, well, are we doing that? I'm gonna be out
So it was kind of a boring night, wasn't it? Absolutely. You interview Blum?